And we're live. I've got Dr. Paul Saladino, MD, here. Paul, thanks for joining. Sorry for the wait. I unnecessarily restarted my computer to get these audio glitches out, and then I realized I didn't even need to restart the computer. So,
Tristan,
dude,
I'm
what's
glad to be
happening?
here, man. It's good to be here again.
You down in San Diego yet?
I'm in Seattle, brother. I'm not in San Diego yet. I'm globe trotting right now. I just got back from a trip to Austin. I was
Nice.
down there talking to some folks about business, and looks like I got some fun conferences going on down there in the next few months. I'm going to be at Paleo FX and KetoCon, and
Oh, there you go.
yeah, yeah.
There you go. Traveling man. Traveling man. Yeah,
I don't like it. I'd rather just be hanging out by a wave somewhere, but I really like talking and stuff. I like the message. So
I love talking to people. I love getting to learn about these things. But what I've learned is I can talk to all these people from Skype, and and I've yet to jump into the conferences. But it should be fun, man. Maybe later this year I'll make it to one of these after our house is done being built.
yeah, I mean, it's work. We'll see. I think that it's all building for me now. I'm at this stage where I think people want to see you in person, and the whole carnivore thing is just really starting to pop. I mean, I think in the next year it's just going to explode, and we'll
Oh
see
yeah,
what happens. But I think it's. I mean, the fact that like I'm going to be talking about carnivore at KetoCon, and
yeah.
Sean Baker is going to be at Paleo FX,
Oh,
and I'm going to hopefully be at Paleo FX giving my own talk next year, and maybe at some of these other conferences. I think it'll be really cool.
it's exciting, man. It's exciting. You're spreading the word. It seems like there's actually been quite a bit of interest in what you got to say. I think the last talk we did was just a few weeks ago, and I've had a lot of people tell me, dude, that was one of the best podcasts I've heard. That was one of the best streams. I loved listening to Dr. Paul Saladino. It blew my mind. So I think you're getting the word out, man. You're doing a good job of explaining this to people.
I'm trying, man. It's super fun. I really like digging into it. Like just before we got on, I was recording another podcast this morning with the guy at Carnivore Cast, who's great, and people can look for that in the next week. And over the weekend, I was recording with some other folks. I got a bunch coming out in the next few weeks, and every time I do a new podcast, I'm like, what am I going to talk about that's new? And I dig into something else, whether it's like mTOR and leucine and insulin, or there's been a lot of hubbub about this methionine glycine balance recently,
Ah,
and then
yeah, yeah. Well,
yeah,
let's
it'll
talk
be
a little
fun
bit
to talk
about
about.
that. What is your position on that now? Because I think I made a tweet the other day, or maybe I talked about it in a stream. But the methionine glycine balance, on paper, it sounds like you could have a point there with increasing intentionally the glycine intake. But I was eating a steak the other day, and I'm just looking at these big ribbons of collagen all throughout this ribeye, and that fat is encased in collagen, and you get those chewy little bits in between your mouth. I'm thinking that it might not be such an issue when it really plays out, but having some broth and stuff like that, something I definitely recommend to people because they're great foods, and eating the whole animal. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that, man? The methionine glycine balance.
Well, you get this evolutionary perspective at the start where I believe that as humans, we're eating the whole animal. Like you said, we're going to eat the skin, we're going to eat the tendons, we're going to eat everything. So if you had a steak with collagen in it, your steak is different than what other people are eating for steak, which might be like a sirloin cut. People
Yeah.
also have to realize that when you eat an animal, you're going to eat every cut on the animal. And so there are some cuts of the animal that are going to have more or less collagenous tissue, more or less actual muscle meat. And by collagenous tissue, I mean like connective tissue, because collagen is a different peptide than what composes most actin and myosin filaments and like the sarcomeres of a muscle fiber. But some steaks are more fibrous. Like for instance, if you were eating lengua, if you were eating tongue,
Mm.
that's all collagen, right? That's like you have to boil the shit out of that to get it to be soft enough to eat. There's a lot of collagen in lengua. And if you eat in New York, you're going to get a big ribbon on the back of that steak, a big tendon on the back of that steak. So if people are eating that, they're getting more collagen. What I worry about is that I don't want people eating just like hamburger, for instance,
Mm.
maybe not as much collagen in hamburger, maybe not as much collagen in like a roast, maybe not as much collagen in like a sirloin or like a very lean thing that doesn't have all the connective bits. So, traditionally what many people have done is they cut off the chewy bits, right? They're not going to eat the chewy bits of a steak.
Yeah.
This is a problem, right? Because here's what we know. The human body doesn't make enough glycine based on average diets. There was a study that I quoted in a discussion with Sean. I'm happy to link to it now, or I can tell people the name of the study if they want to see it. Let me pull it up real quick.
Cool. Yeah.
So the study is, this is one of the studies that I talked about. A weak link in metabolism, the metabolic capacity for glycine biosynthesis does not satisfy the need for collagen synthesis. And these people are this paper is looking at people on a mixed diet in, I believe I think it's France. And what they found was that though glycine is considered a conditionally essential amino acid, meaning that we can make some of it from serine, we make about 3 grams a day. And that in people like in France, they usually only got 1.5 to 3 grams a day in addition to that. And they felt that 4.5 to 6 grams a day of glycine was falling significantly short of what was needed for all metabolic uses, including collagen synthesis, and making glutathione would probably be equally important in the human body. So glutathione and collagen are the two main peptides which glycine is contributing to. And they felt that amount of collagen was at least 10 grams per day deficient for a 70 kilogram human, suggesting that in that setting, glycine was probably a essential amino acid rather than a conditionally essential amino acid. Now, admittedly, this is in mixed diets of people in France. When you are eating steak, you are getting a heck of a lot more glycine than that. If we look at steak meat, and different cuts of the animal have different amounts of glycine and methionine, but generally speaking, muscle meat of an animal is about 7 to 8% glycine and about 2% methionine. People probably say, oh, well, that's plenty. You get tons more glycine than methionine, but we haven't even talked about the actual methionine glycine balance yet. So the muscle meat of an animal is 2% methionine, 7 to 8% glycine. Collagen is about 0.9% methionine and about 24% glycine, because one of the 3 amino acids in collagen is glycine. Collagen is glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline. So you're getting a lot more glycine when you're eating all the connective tissue parts of the animal. So the question then becomes, if you are eating a high methionine diet, like a high muscle meat diet, is that extra methionine going to increase your glycine need? The reason I'm asking that question is because we have seen from animal and human studies that a high methionine diet without enough glycine is a fairly bad position to be in metabolically. It puts stress on the body in terms of collagen synthesis and glutathione, the major antioxidant synthesis. So in rats, that is a toxic condition because there's extra production of S-adenosylmethionine from the methionine, and that can create problems. The wrinkle that I sort of alluded to there is the fact that glycine is used to buffer excess methionine. So in our metabolism, when there's excess methionine, glycine is used to buffer that. So by getting more methionine, the question is, are we using up some of that glycine to buffer it? And what I recommend to people is that they add collagen and or bone broth and or eat tendons and or direct glycine supplementation in the form of amino acid glycine to just ensure that the methionine glycine balance is adequate, because the downside is pretty negative metabolically, and the downside of having excess collagen or glycine is fairly benign. There's really not a whole lot of detriment there. There are a few things that we can talk about, but it's really not a big deal to have a little bit excess. So there are ways to actually test this, and if one wanted to test, we could do the science. And so it would be an interesting experiment to try and put someone on a carnivorous diet with all meat and no specific supplementation of collagen, and then check the markers I would check would be pyroglutamate, which is a breakdown product of glutathione when there's inadequate glycine. And then you can actually check a serum glycine level or a plasma glycine level, and you can look at glutathione levels. So these are all testable things, and I hope that people in the community who don't want to eat collagen or who are saying there's enough glycine just in muscle meat it would be easily settled just by checking to make sure the pyroglutamate levels are not elevated, that there's enough serum glycine, and there's enough glutathione. I'm not sure.
We've got
I
some
think
things
that
for Dave Feldman to start testing out there. We got some
right. And I talked to Sean about this, and Sean is a great guy. I'm good friends with him. He's not a fan of lab tests, but if people were interested, I would recommend that they get a pyroglutamate serum and plasma glycine levels and check their glutathione in both oxidized and reduced forms to make sure they're not glycine insufficient, because that's an important nutrient for humans. So
What
in
kind of
my
costs are we
opinion,
looking at on these tests? They sound like they're not very common and might not be very cheap. I mean, maybe the glutathione might not be. The glutathione's probably kind of prevalent, but
pyroglutamate.
yeah, the pyroglutamate. I mean, what are we looking at as lab costs?
Pyroglutamate is included as a urinary organic acid.
Cool.
You can get that test with a functional medicine doc like myself or someone else for a couple $100 through like Great Plains or Genova. So there's a test that I do with my clients called a Nutri-Eval from Genova, which costs about $200, which has all of those in it. It has glutathione, glycine, and pyroglutamate, and like probably 150 other
Loads
data
of
points as well.
metabolites, right? So
Yeah,
many
yeah, yeah.
different points
Loads of
you can look at now.
metabolites. So
Yeah,
the
the
idea
testing's
is,
really getting amazing. I'm
yeah,
somewhere in between you and Dr. Sean Baker as far as the testing, right? Downsides of the testing can be kind of expensive, I guess. Upsides to the testing, fantastic. The accuracy that they're getting now, it's really, really amazing how accurate they're getting. I question how well we can really understand what these biomarkers mean in context, which, I tend to side with Sean Baker on some of these things of like, there's so many questions that pop up whenever one single lab value gets isolated.
yeah,
Because we're looking at systems within systems, and this is why I love talking to you. You're looking at this holistically. You're not just looking at it as like, oh my goodness, your cholesterol is high, you're gonna die. You're looking at a holistic system of systems. So
yes, yes, and I'm open to the possibility that we are getting enough glycine in muscle meat. I just like to provide the insurance with a little bit of supplemental glycine, eating a way that I think is kind of evolutionarily consistent, and then try to back it up with as much science as I can in terms of lab testing. Like I've tested those things on myself and my clients. And
yeah,
I think that in order to advance the field, the lab testing is valuable, at least from an academic perspective.
yeah,
If people are feeling good, they may not need this testing. I would caution people against just eating muscle meat without doing the testing, because it could have long-term consequences, but it's up to them. But for
yeah.
myself and for, it's important, I feel like, for me to do the testing on myself, and for the clients that I work with, it's valuable to have that information. And then it helps us kind of push the field forward and say, hey, look at all these things we're testing, like, this is amazing. The glutathione looks fantastic on a carnivorous diet.
It makes it much harder to straw man carnivore for stupid things like saturated fat, cholesterol levels. You're going to die of a heart attack. Meat causes cancer. It makes it a lot easier to refute this when you've just like, well, look at my freaking labs. Look at the before and look at the after.
People love to straw man carnivore.
Oh,
They love
yeah.
it.
It's so easily straw manned, right? I mean, it's very, very prominent out there. Now, thanks a lot for discussing that. What I intended to talk about today, we discussed this a little bit beforehand, is I want to talk about the connection between diet, nutrition, and mental health, psychological health, because you are a psychiatrist, you're a trained psychiatrist, and I think it's something that gets often overlooked and misunderstood, is the relationship between what we put in our bodies and how we feel internally in our internal state.
Yeah.
So yeah, how did you start to make the connection between diet, psychology, psychiatry, and mental health? How did this become prominent in your consciousness, and why did you want to explore this so deeply that you ended up getting a PhD in it?
Oh, I'm an MD.
Oh,
It's
I'm
an
sorry,
MD.
you're MD.
Give me my degree, Tristan. Give
There
me
you
the
go.
right degree.
There you go.
I worked hard.
Dang it.
So, the story is long, but I went to medical school after being a PA in cardiology. So I worked as a PA in cardiology for 4 years. Before that, I was a ski bum and I had a lot of adventures, but I was working in medicine as a PA in cardiology. And at that point, I really realized quickly that I wasn't satisfied with the mainstream medical model, and was really sad that we were not treating the root cause of illness. I got interested in functional medicine and root cause medicine, and decided to go back to medical school to get my MD at the University of Arizona. And then during that process, I was interested in functional medicine the whole time. And I think I planned throughout that process, I had always planned to do functional medicine or root cause medicine. So I'm always thinking throughout all of my medical education and in medical school, and even before that as a PA, I've just been obsessed with the root cause of illness and sort of asking myself and asking others and reading articles, like what is the root cause of an illness? Is it diet? Is it genetics? Is it toxins? Is it nutritional insufficiencies? It's probably all of those. But in my experience, when I see something that appears to target the root cause of an illness or a family of illnesses, that is super fascinating to me. That gets my attention in really strong ways, because that is what it's about for me. And, in medical school, I was interested in internal medicine, which is kind of like general medicine. I love the way it all fits together, but I also loved the story and the narrative of psychiatry and how poignant people's stories are when they come to the hospital and they say they want to kill themselves or they're depressed or they're anxious. These are actual real human emotions that affect their whole lives. And so I love the story behind that. And I always wanted to understand those things at a biochemical, neurological level. And so I wanted to understand the medicine, the biochemistry behind the chemistry of our brains that are creating these illnesses. The huge irony and or misunderstanding and or paradigm shift is that it is the physiology of our entire body that creates mood states rather than just the physiology of our brains. This is sort of the new thinking in psychiatry versus the old thinking. In medicine in general, the old thinking is you draw a box around every organ system, and that organ system exists in a vacuum. The brain is the brain, and the problems in the brain begin and end in the brain. We know this is bullshit. We know this is false.
Yeah,
Problems
the
in the
vagus
brain,
nerve, right?
vagus nerve, the gut, micronutrients, the spleen, everything, right? Inflammation anywhere in your body could contribute to imbalance in the brain. So this is the main difference that is happening now in paradigms, and I hope it's happening more and more in traditional medicine, that we are starting to have to think outside of the box, literally and figuratively, and think about the way that all of these pieces of the body are connected. Now, this is very challenging for many Western doctors because they say, "Oh, I'm a cardiologist. I didn't learn endocrinology. I don't want to think about the thyroid, or I don't want to think about the pancreas." But this is our challenge as physicians. Is I don't see myself as a psychiatrist. I just see myself as a physician, and I have a keen interest in mental health. But the health of anyone's brain is connected intimately to every other single system in their body: the immune system, the gut, the hormonal system, the digestive system, every piece, the heart, the thyroid, every piece of that plays into their brain. So I can't think about just the brain. And so similar to that, paradigms in psychiatry are starting to change. Unfortunately, not as quickly as I would like. Many in the psychiatric world still imagine the brain to be the root of the problem, and we treat psychiatric illnesses with things that only target the brain, right? We use medications, whether they're antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, antipsychotics, or mood stabilizers, that only target the brain. I will do a dance and I will send you a video and post it on the internet the day that psychiatrists begin treating the problems with the brain by treating the whole body, using things that treat the whole body.
Right.
But that's the way that I think about it. And we are beginning to realize this now, that psychiatric illness is probably the majority of the time inflammatory and autoimmune in nature. And what I mean by that is activation of the immune system in the central nervous system is probably one of the more proximate events in psychiatric illness. Not all the time. The hard thing about psychiatric illness is that we don't have a lot of great biomarkers. And sometimes people are depressed because they have a lot of stress in their life. Now, that may not be an inflammatory thing at the root. Now, it could lead to an
But stress
inflammation.
can lead to that, right? I mean, it's almost like a chicken or egg situation with a lot of it, because I mean, you can have a traumatic event, or a relationship falls apart, and then suddenly you start eating like shit. You start not sleeping.
Yes.
You're stressed out, fight or flight mode all the time. You're going to get, vagus nerve issues. Your vagal nerve tone will decrease. So you're going to have all sorts of issues that would affect neurochemistry, that would affect the body. But it's hard to say if it's like what started it.
Where does it begin and end? Yes, exactly.
But
And I
what
think that
matters,
goes
I
on-
guess, is the outcomes, right? Like, how do you treat it? Does
Exactly.
it does
How
it
do you-
matter how it started if, when you change your diet, you stop having suicidal tendencies?
That is the craziest thing, man, and we'll get to that. But yeah, I think there is activation. There's clear evidence that there is activation of the immune system in the brain and spinal cord in many patients with depression, anxiety, OCD, schizophrenia, these psychiatric disorders. And that is a radical concept, because when the immune system gets activated in the central nervous system, we are having neuroinflammation and oftentimes having autoimmunity, activation of brain-derived macrophages called microglial cells in the brain that correlate with severity of depression, severity of suicidal thoughts. We can see this. We can look at data which show that in suicide completers, in people with depression of increasing severity, you see increased markers of inflammation in the central nervous system, specifically interleukin 6, and you see increased flipping or increased shift in the microglial phenotype in those tissues from an M1 to an M2, or just basically the microglia, these brain-derived macrophages, these brain immune cells get turned on. The switch gets turned on, and so there's brain inflammation. And the question becomes, where is that coming from? And it doesn't come from the central nervous system. It comes from the rest of the body, because there are cytokines produced by inflammation and immune activation in other parts of the body that cross the blood-brain barrier and say, hey, there's something going on out here. You guys need to be inflamed too. That's generally how it happens. And so what we have is a shift in the old paradigm where there's inflammation in the brain and the problem lies outside of the brain. The proximate events lie outside of the brain. So then the question becomes, why, where outside of the brain, what is causing that? And that's the kind of stuff that's so interesting to me, and why I originally became interested in the carnivore diet, because what you see, on this diet that's so striking is that a lot of people with recalcitrant, treatment-resistant depression, anxiety get better. I will tell you that anxiety itself is one of the hardest things to treat as a psychiatrist. As a physician, anxiety is really hard to treat. SSRIs.
What's the standard of care? I mean, aren't you looking at like the benzodiazepines and highly addictive, really difficult to get off of drugs? I mean, I remember in college, I had quite a few friends who were prescribed like, benzos. I forget what the one was called that.
Xanax or
not
Klonopin.
Klonopin, that's the one. That's a beast of a drug, that Klonopin, man. That I've seen some people really mess themselves up with that, even just using it recreationally.
Oh yeah. Benzodiazepines are not necessarily first line for anxiety, but they work for anxiety at a molecular level. They're highly addictive because they change the frequency with which the GABA channel, which is, it's a chloride channel in the brain, opens. So benzodiazepines, barbiturates, alcohol act on the same channel in the brain, and the brain adjusts very quickly, and they're quite habit forming. And just any of those medications, whether it's a barbiturate like phenobarbital, benzodiazepine like Xanax or Klonopin, or alcohol, when we stop those medications, people die. They have autonomic instability, they have seizures. It's a big deal. Yeah. They're horrible medications. First line medications for anxiety are usually SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are not great medications either. We know they have sexual side effects, other side effects, throughout the body. They can cause changes.
A lot of them have appetite side effects too, right?
Yes, they in addition to appetite side effects, they probably affect the mitochondria and can cause some insulin resistance as well.
Do you think they're affecting the mitochondria through the GABA system in the brain, and it's affecting the mitochondria there, and that might affect hunger and these things that way?
No, the serotonin, the SSRIs don't affect the GABA system.
Oh, no, I was wondering about the
benzodiazepines.
The benzodiazepines, because those seem to have an effect on hunger too. People tend to gain weight when they use those.
Yeah, and it's hard to know whether it's a satiety thing having to do with leptin and ghrelin, or like a mitochondrial thing. Because if we look at other psychiatric medications, like antipsychotic medications, like Zyprexa or olanzapine or risperidone, those definitely cause diabetes. Those cause metabolic syndrome, because they are mitochondrial toxins. So those, generally there are multiple ways which people can gain weight. You can create weight gain and metabolic syndrome in someone by inhibiting the mitochondrial processes, by poisoning the mitochondria. Statins do this a little bit. We know that. People debate how much, and these antipsychotic medications do that very strongly. If anyone knows a patient or someone that's been on olanzapine, for instance, people often gain hundreds of pounds on this medication. And then we can also affect weight gain with SSRIs. I don't know if it's through a mitochondrial mechanism or through a satiety mechanism involving leptin and ghrelin and serotonin. But yes, there are weight gain effects to these, as well as electrolyte effects. They cause low sodium, hyponatremia. all kinds of problems. These medications don't work well for anxiety, and they have bad side effects. They're not treating the root cause. They're not treating the root cause. The root cause of depression and anxiety is not inadequate serotonin production. That's just not the root cause. It's not that you don't make enough serotonin. Some people may benefit from some conditions with a little more serotonin, but there are reasons. The root cause is often inflammation. The inflammation can trigger shunting of tryptophan metabolites to other spaces in the body, and then you don't always make enough serotonin. But you are not correcting the root cause by simply changing the way someone's serotonin reuptake pump works at the neuronal synapse, which is how the SSRIs work. But what's interesting is probably a better word. What's interesting is that dietary modification, specifically carnivore diets, I've seen them be the most efficient, the most efficacious intervention for anxiety that I've ever seen in my life.
Wow.
It's really cool. I mean, when nothing else works to treat anxiety, removing plants seems to really help people a lot, which is just paradigm shifting. Because
and it's almost the opposite, because we've been told plants are great, plants are medicine, right? We need to be eating as many plants, fruits, vegetables, fresh fruits, and raw vegetables as we can to get our, the antioxidants, to get the phytonutrients. What the heck is going on here, man? Why is removing plants benefiting people's mentality, benefiting their mental health?
We don't know exactly, but my hypothesis is that the plants are an immunologic trigger. That things like lectins, on my Instagram yesterday, I posted about lectins, and that in animal models, we see that in worms and in mice and rats, when we give these animals lectins, they are actually taken up and transit through the vagus nerve to the brain. And then there are other population studies of people who have had, these are humans who have had vagotomies. They've had the vagus nerve severed for some other medical reasons. And in the Danish population that was studied, when people had vagotomies and the vagus nerve was severed, they had a 40% lower incidence of Parkinson's disease, suggesting all the stuff I posted yesterday was about a Parkinson's disease model, that for some people, this transit of these plant lectins through the vagus nerve to the brain, and then they're differentially adjusting or changing dopaminergic signaling in the basal ganglia, the substantia nigra, that can affect Parkinson's disease in these patients potentially. We don't have a direct link in humans, but in animal studies we see it. And then in humans who have had the vagus nerve severed, we see less incidence of Parkinson's disease.
Well,
so
there have been some studies on ketogenic diets for neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. Would we be looking at a similar mechanism perhaps of affecting vagal nerve tone, affecting gut-brain permeability, stuff like that? What do you think's going on?
Possibly.
Keto in absence of plant restriction seems to be useful.
And I think that full plant restriction is probably even better.
Oh, yeah.
I think there are benefits to ketones in Parkinson's disease that are separate from this mechanism. Yeah. Some of the mutations in Parkinson's disease have to do with one of the mitochondrial respiratory electron transport chain complexes. And by using ketones as fuel, we can bypass that. So beta-hydroxybutyrate ketones appear to be uniquely beneficial in Parkinson's disease and mitochondrial diseases because they allow the body to deliver electrons to the electron transport chain in the mitochondrial membrane in a different way that can bypass mutations in that chain. There's evidence that Parkinson's has mutations in the electron transport chain. So I think that, yes, ketogenic diets can be beneficial. Potentially, ketogenic diets eliminate some lectins, right? Because the highest lectin foods are probably the nuts, grains, seeds, and legumes.
Yeah, you're pulling out all grains. Most people aren't eating any seeds and nuts. Some people are still eating some nuts, but
yeah. But at least the one that people talk about a lot are the legumes, and the red kidney bean, phytohemagglutinin is a very powerful lectin, things like that. So
and what's crazy, what's crazy? These are some of the foods that are the most touted among vegan circles for health, vitality, longevity, the legumes, the beans. And I don't know if you've noticed, man, but there has been a flood, and we're dealing with these people all the time. We're running a vegan rescue operation here. We're a vegan sanctuary. And
like people come to your place?
Well, not my physical house. Stay away from the physical. But no, we host a lot. We do like a group coaching thing, our Keto and Carnivore Collective, and we often will sponsor former vegans who are leaving the diet because they don't really know where to start. So we just try to help them eat more animal foods. And man, the amount of depression, anxiety, mental and physical deterioration that you see in the vegan community is just very marked. And you see a lot of people on like prominent vegan YouTubers talking about this openly now, about how they're leaving veganism because depression, anxiety, massive gut issues, inflammatory responses to all their foods. They can't eat these foods anymore. So
It's all connected.
yeah, yeah. And
It's all connected.
have you seen the studies on like low cholesterol? This is kind of an ancillary thing, but low
Yeah.
cholesterol being associated with more violent crime, depression,
Yes.
suicide, anxiety.
Yes.
So I mean,
Yeah.
these are definitely connected.
Yeah. If you look at the population studies for primary prevention with statins, that is when they give statins to large populations of people who have not had cardiovascular events, the data is very poor that it helps, that there's any net benefit. In fact, there's probably a net harm. And what you see is perhaps a small reduction in cardiovascular risk events with an increase in mortality due to other things like violent deaths and other problems. So in primary prevention studies, statins clearly cause a lot of problems in people that don't have heart disease. And I'm not saying statins are necessarily great for people who have heart disease. I'm just saying that there is data to suggest that in people who have had heart attacks, which we would call secondary prevention, statins do look beneficial. I don't think that they're necessarily the best option or intervention, but I'm contrasting that with the fact that in primary prevention trials, there's really not a lot of evidence that statins are beneficial for cardiovascular disease. And in those primary prevention trials, you see all of the other negative effects, all of these increased violent crimes and other things that happen when you push the LDL too low.
Yeah.
So yeah, we know we need cholesterol to make neurons and glia and membranes.
Yeah, there's a really cool study that I had pulled up earlier. It was what was it called? Dietary cholesterol promotes repair of demyelinated lesions in the adult brain. I'm sure you've seen this one. So I mean, that's just I mean, that's kind of mind-blowing right there. We're told to reduce our fat intake, reduce cholesterol intake. All the while, neurodegenerative diseases, depression, anxiety, all these things are wreaking havoc on us. And could demyelination be playing a major part in depressive disorders?
So myelin sheaths are sort of like arm warmers on neurons or leg warmers on neurons. Like those 80s leg warmers that people put on their calves?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. They're super hot. So like that's kind of like what myelin sheaths are. So there's a neuron, it has a neuron body, it has an axon, it has dendrites. But between the body and the neuronal synapse is the axon, and that axon is myelinated, meaning that axon of that neuron is wearing a bunch of leg warmers. And those are myelin sheaths. Certainly demyelination could contribute to all sorts of problems in terms of mood and behavior. Demyelination at an autoimmune level is what happens at the root of demyelinating diseases like multiple sclerosis or some of these other infectious or autoimmune diseases like subacute sclerosing panencephalitis or things like that. So, which is a measles complication in the brain that has demyelination lesions. So, but yeah, demyelination of neurons is not a good thing. And we need enough cholesterol around to do that because cholesterol is used to make membranes and myelin is made of similar things to membranes. The myelin sheath is made of molecules like that. So, and we have cells like glial cells in the brain that do that. They need the precursors. Now, how much cholesterol we need for that is not, we're not sure about that, but cholesterol has many valuable roles. The whole cholesterol discussion is quite complex.
Yeah. Well, this study says also it's dietary cholesterol specifically, whereas, a lot of the vegan apologists will say, well, your body can create its own cholesterol. You don't need to eat any dietary cholesterol because you'll just make it. But, I mean, this is an interesting study right here showing, direct link between dietary cholesterol and repairing the freaking brain.
Super important, super interesting stuff. It's really wild. I think that, there's going to be a lot of battles fought over cholesterol in the next 10 years. And
we've already had 40 good years of battling it. So I guess
I know
10 years
and
more.
carnivore and keto fronts are going to be, you and I are going to be at the forefront of talking to people about why we shouldn't worry about this as much. I mean, that's not to say we shouldn't worry about LDL and that in some settings, it certainly, I think, plays a role. LDL does in atherosclerosis. It's a nuanced role that people don't understand. And I don't think all LDL is bad. I think LDL is getting oxidized. And if we can prevent the oxidation of LDL, and we can look at other metrics that give us a better sense of the atherogenicity of the different particles in our blood, then we'll be in a better space. I think LDL is an atherogenic particle, but not all LDL is created equally. So it's a pretty nuanced discussion around when we need to be worried about that. Dave Feldman has spoken a lot about this. There are measures, if people want to talk about cholesterol and how to know if their cholesterol is okay, they'd want to get more sophisticated measures of cholesterol like NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, panels of cholesterol showing particle size, particle number, HDL size, HDL number. You want to look at remnant cholesterol, which is easily calculated. And then there's atherogenicity indices, which we can calculate to give us a sense of that. So, and then in the setting of insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, and underlying inflammation. So when people say, they send me like 3 numbers, this is my LDL, this is my triglycerides, this is my HDL, should I be worried? I'm like, I don't have a clue, man. I need about 7 more numbers or 8 more numbers to know, and I need to see, I need to see your body and I need to know all these things. So it's complex.
Right. No, and it's always with diet as well, right? So someone's like, well, hey, I'm getting headaches when I'm starting this diet. It's like, well, I mean, what do you even look at first? Like, well, how much are you eating? How much fat and protein are you consuming? What does your salt intake look like? Like, are you are you cooking the crap out of your meat so you're killing all the potassium content? I mean, there's so many little things that could affect just one little thing, and that's why I like talking to you, because you're always taking things in context. Let's talk a little bit about carnitine. What role is carnitine playing in brain health, psychological, and possible mental health issues, and how might this be affected by vegan, vegetarian diets, and conversely carnivorous or very high animal food intake?
Yeah, so there are more and more studies coming out that correlate depression and anxiety with low levels of carnitine. I'd have to pull it up. I probably have it somewhere in my computer, but I think there was a study that showed by quartile, when we say quartile or quintile or tertile, we're dividing a population into 3 or 4 or 5 sectors of people. And in every sector of people, we're having increasing or decreasing amounts of the compound that we're talking about. So I believe it was a study that looked at people by quartile of L-carnitine in the blood. And I think that there was a direct link or a correlation. All of those studies are epidemiology, so they're correlative studies. But they are saying that as you had more carnitine, there was less of an incidence of depression. And as you had less, there was more of an incidence of depression. Now, carnitine is a unique molecule. We are able to make some carnitine in our bodies, but we probably cannot make enough. And it's one of these things that's probably conditionally essential. And often in my clients, I see indicators that carnitine is deficient. And then we get into the nuance of like why we make carnitine and what might use the carnitine up. But we know that meat-based diets, whole foods, animal-based diets, nose to tail, carnivore type diets are going to be very high in carnitine because carnitine is only found in animal products. I'm not aware of any plant food that has carnitine in it. Are you?
No, but I mean, some of these vegans consider powders plant foods, right? So if you buy a carnitine powder, it's like apparently that's a whole food plant-based diet, right? You got your pea isolate protein powder. I mean,
yeah, with all the lectins that are going to give you Parkinson's in a susceptible population, right?
Right. I mean, well, how you almost see this Parkinson's manifesting at a younger age in some of these people too. I mean, you start to watch some of the YouTube videos. I'm not trying to call anybody out specifically, but it's like you watch some of these YouTube videos of some of these guys, long-term vegan dieters, and you see right before your eyes the brain fog. There's like jump cut, jump cut, jump cut, jump cut, jump cut every few seconds, man. Whereas, someone like Paul jumps up and he's just riffing for 30 minutes. He's like, I got to shut up now. I'll stop talking. And he bounces. So I think we are seeing the effects of these right before our very eyes. But of course, we're not, measuring it. This is more observational. We're not doing any studies on this.
Yeah. So no plant sources of carnitine. And carnitine is really essential in the human body for a variety of things. One of the most important being its role in shuttling fatty acids across the mitochondrial membrane for beta oxidation. So when I do, going back to the organic acids test, I do organic acids testing on a lot of my clients, and there are a few markers on the organic acids test that give me a sense of carnitine insufficiency because they're related to fatty acid oxidation. So if we want to do ketosis, if we want to burn fat for energy, if we want to take fatty acid molecules and do beta oxidation, we need carnitine to move those molecules across the mitochondrial membrane where we can do that beta oxidation. And if we are deficient, we are not going to do that well. We're going to be inefficient. So it could lead to all sorts of problems in energy metabolism, clarity of thought, cognition, overall energy, not tolerating ketogenic diets very well. So this is one of the problems. People go on ketogenic diets and they just fail. They just can't do ketosis. You think like, well, you may just have a complete carnitine deficiency. That it's not that you can't do ketosis. I think everyone's body can do ketosis. We know this evolutionarily. But if people absolutely tank on keto, or they feel horrible when they start a carnivorous diet, they may have a pre-existing carnitine deficiency due to a variety of things, not the least of which might be an overly vegetabilized diet, leading to a major problem here. And they may benefit from some supplementation to get them to a reasonable level, or the meat will eventually help. But yeah, so carnitine is connected to mental health. I'm not sure we fully understand the mechanisms, but it does seem to be associated pretty strongly. And again, this gets back to the idea, meat is good for your brain. And this goes back to one of the first things we were talking about. The idea is that, I believe that a lot of psychiatric disease is autoimmune. I believe that plants are causing autoimmunity through a variety of mechanisms, be it lectins, be it plant pesticides, and that removing those plants probably eliminates much of that autoimmune burden, which could be triggering the psychiatric disease. So that's really the A to B to C here. Like, plants triggering autoimmunity triggering psychiatric disease, and that's how it all goes.
So removing the root cause of the inflammation tends to help resolve a lot of these neuroinflammatory responses that would be like, depression, anxiety, stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's really striking, and it's pretty amazing when you see it. People just don't really understand, and that's what we're seeing with carnivorous diets.
Yeah, Michaela Peterson, Jordan Peterson. I mean, those are great examples right there.
Inflammatory conditions. Michaela Peterson had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is clearly autoimmune. I can't even tell you how many people have been texting me on Instagram recently about IBD, so Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis.
Almost
eczema.
every day I get people telling me, dude, I was bleeding every day. I was having chronic constipation, and I got off of all the plants. First, they usually try keto, and they find that it gets them a little bit, but it doesn't get them where they need to go. They remove the plants, and they stop bleeding from their butthole every day, and they feel good again.
I love the keto to carnivore improvements. I love those success stories because I really appreciate ketogenic diets. I really appreciate Paleolithic diets. For some people, that transition from a standard diet to a paleo diet or keto gets them where they want to go, and that's amazing. But knowing that there's another step, there's another place you can go if you have persistent autoimmunity, that's really powerful for people. And I get really excited when I see that because it sort of starts to strengthen, at least with increasing anecdote, the hypothesis that plants are potentially triggering this for a lot of people. And the full removal of all plants is a very powerful therapeutic tool. And I think we'll probably see as we move forward that it's even more than that. But at this point, as a therapeutic tool, I think it's incredibly powerful.
So in your practice, when you're working with clients now, what other types of responses are you getting? I mean, other than improvements in mental, in cognition, and in mental health, and resolving major depression, what else are you seeing that might surprise some people when they're switching to a more carnivorous diet and removing all plants?
I think that the two biggest things that we see are resolution and improvement in joint pain and the mental health stuff. That and autoimmunity, those are probably the three biggest things. But I mean, in the people that I'm working with, the joint pain is striking, and you kind of see that throughout the space. People say, my joint pain got so much better when I stopped eating plants. Whether that's related to oxalates or autoimmunity or a combination of the two, we don't know yet. But people with pain issues seem to get a lot better, whether it's joint pain, all these things, that improves quite a bit. I've had people improve definitely from mental clarity perspective, which could be at least in part related to ketosis.
But
People
there
also
seems to be
improve.
something beyond ketosis too, because we see less ketone production on a very high meat intake diet, where you're having, a little bit more protein, not really worrying so much about, elevating the fat intake. Although, I tend to do more of a ketogenic style. Kind of, I guess my diet probably looks a little bit more like paleo medicina stuff. Although it's
Yeah,
not 2 to 1 grams of fat to protein, I think that's a little bit high on the fat for me. But
that's
yeah,
really high on the fat, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's a little bit much, but I would love to talk to them and hear about what the results that they've been getting, because it seems they've been getting really good results with cancers and some of these autoimmune conditions.
Yeah, generally I see people who have issues with energy, mental health stuff, autoimmune diseases, skin stuff. And yeah, it's
Yeah.
fairly
Rheumatoid
striking.
arthritis. Somebody's in the chat talking about their rheumatoid arthritis, and this is something that definitely
Yeah.
seems to be benefited from it.
Yeah, the autoimmunity is this is this is going to really, I really am excited, Tristan. I think this is going to change the paradigm once Western medicine gets done trying to vilify you and I think that the paradigm will shift rapidly and in a very strong way, and people will, I mean, it'll be a really good day when the Western medical community accepts the fact that for some people plants may be triggering autoimmunity. That is a
Yeah.
fucking radical
Well,
concept, man.
Phil Escott. So Phil Escott was dealing with a major autoimmune condition, and his knees were. I mean, he was telling me his knees swelled up to the size of like a softball when he was in one of his major flare-ups, and he ended up finding that going on a low carbohydrate diet, and then ultimately, and a completely animal-based carnivorous diet, totally got rid of it. So you and Phil and I have been talking about doing a course, which we'll probably end up. We'll give a little teaser here. We might be announcing that soon. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people out there are getting major autoimmune conditions in total remission. Like they forget that what it even felt like to suffer that much. And I mean, shoot, like what? How can you tell somebody, oh no, it doesn't count, right? It's like, oh, it's bad because it's animal foods, or you're going to get heart disease anyway, so it doesn't really matter, and you should stop it. It's just so hard to tell somebody to avoid animal foods altogether, or to even understand the justification for avoiding animal foods when we're seeing people stop their suffering with a complete animal food diet.
Yeah, and I mean, this is an interesting point that you bring up there. I do not believe that animal foods cause heart disease or cancer. There are some that I've debated, like Lane Norton likes to say, oh, well, we think there's one diet that might be good for your heart, but it's going to give you cancer. I think that's absolute bullshit. Like,
It's
I
the
just don't,
calories. It's the
I
calories.
just don't cut your calories. I don't believe that, I just do not believe theoretically, philosophically, that a diet that improves rheumatoid arthritis is also going to give you a heart attack.
Mm.
I think that is balkanized medicine. That is systems-based medicine without looking at the whole. I think that if a diet is improving rheumatoid arthritis, that diet is improving inflammation, and inflammation is behind heart disease. I think that if we can see people losing weight and improving inflammation, improving autoimmunity, that should be a very strong hypothesis that that diet is doing all good things for their body. I cannot be assured that everyone doing a carnivorous diet is going to meet all their micronutrient requirements, which is sort of my interest in nose to tail eating and the importance of connective tissue and organ meat and all this kind of thing. But when I think if we are doing something, if a human is doing something and their eczema is getting better, or their psoriasis is getting better, or their joint swelling is getting better, I do not believe that what they are doing is also going to have a negative effect somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot be assured that what they are doing is going to give them all the nutrients they need long term. But immunologically, they are affecting that phenomena in a very positive way, which I believe is a very good thing. I do worry that Jordan and Michaela are going to run into nutrient deficiencies long term. So
And how
I
would you
know they're
go about?
both.
So they do eat a lot of just straight muscle meat, and I did see Michaela put like a picture of liver, and she seemed like she was maybe enjoying some liver lately.
Oh, Michaela eats liver. That's
I
great.
don't know. I don't know. I was supposed to talk to her this week, but we had to reschedule because she was really busy. She had to go work with her pops on something. But I think she's eating a little bit of liver now. I'll have to confirm with Michaela in a few weeks.
Yeah, that
Um,
makes me much more assured that it's a better diet. Yeah, I mean, I just you would just, I mean, if you're thinking about organ meats, right? Muscle meat is going to leave us deficient in a few predictable things. Vitamin A, folate, biotin, and copper would be the top four.
Mhm.
So I would just test those things. That's what I do with my clients. I test zinc and copper, which are connected, right? If we eat too much muscle meat and we're only eating zinc, then we are going to get copper deficient because excess copper is going to cause us to waste. Excess zinc is going to cause us to waste copper, and
Yeah.
copper deficiency is a big deal because there are many enzymes in the body that also use copper. Over supplementation with copper is also dangerous. So I don't recommend that, which is why it's best to really get it
What
from
would
the animal
happen with
foods.
supplementation, over supplementation of copper? What
Over
could,
supplementation of copper will cause frank oxidative stress. So it's poisonous.
mm-hmm.
So you don't want to have excess copper, which is one of the reasons you don't want to cook in like copper pans. And the same with like selenium.
Yeah.
Some selenium is good, too much is toxic. Excess copper, excess selenium is usually a syndrome that looks like nausea, vomiting, malaise, fatigue, dizziness, weirdness, neurologic symptoms. But copper deficiency also causes neurologic symptoms that mimic B12 deficiency. But if you're eating animal foods, you won't have this happen. If we're not doing a supplement and we're eating animals, we're not going to get excess zinc and we're not going to get excess copper as long as we eat the liver. But if we only eat the muscle meat, we're going to get copper deficient, and that's going to be a real problem.
Yeah.
And then there's also vitamin A. There's no vitamin A in muscle meat like there is in egg yolks for liver.
Right.
And there's not enough folate in muscle meat, and there's not enough biotin in muscle meat.
So folate would be much more prominent in liver. You could get a
Yes.
decent amount of folate in liver.
Yep. In egg yolks. Yep.
Yeah. Now,
Yep.
you know what's
Biotin
interesting? You'll probably be interested in this because you're always looking at things holistically, right? So it's like when we're looking at sourcing our food, you're looking at the same way, I'm sure, whereas you're trying to go for local, grass-fed, trying to support regenerative agriculture. And a friend of mine, he's got a YouTube channel, Carnivore. I was talking to him and his wife the other day. I was talking to his wife. And they've got goats. They've got about 20-something goats on a few acres, and they live off their land, right? So, and he's on a mostly carnivorous diet. And what's interesting is they were getting some issues with reproduction in their goats, and they figured out through much trial and error that it wasn't due to all these other factors in the soil, but it was coming down to a copper deficiency in the soil, which was affecting the goats' the abilities to reproduce. The only way that you can know if an animal has copper deficiency as a farmer, the only way you're able to do it is a biopsy of the liver. So, yeah, eating liver is great, but if the animal that's eating, or the animal that you're eating had a copper deficiency also, you might also be looking at deficiencies. So, maybe high grain diets could be affecting nutrient availability in non-grass-fed animals as well. I'm not saying that that's definitely happening, but I think with organs, it's more important to go for the grass-fed than if you're going to eat a steak and you can't afford, if it's your health or if it's between if you can't afford grass-fed beef, don't starve yourself. Eat the Costco steaks. You still need some meat, but if you're going to eat organ meats, I would say definitely go for the grass-fed.
Yeah, without a doubt. And organ meats are really I would say the linchpin. They're the crux. So if you know the farmer that's producing the organ meats, even better. If you know where the cows are grazing, if you know the land that they're on, if you know the health of the animal before, fantastic. Yeah, the better quality organ meat that you can get, I'm all about it, which is why I don't skimp on eggs either. When I go to the store and I buy eggs, I get the most expensive eggs, which are getting to be pretty expensive, but I try and get organic, pasture raised, local.
Yeah.
I want like the super orange eggs. And I'll pay
You see it
for
too. We notice when we give our chickens meat, when we give them our meat scraps, and sometimes we'll even give them some fish scraps, and we have that. Their egg production increases dramatically.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and the yolks are just big, thick, and the albumin. You notice it'll be thicker, and it'll be more gelatinous. So we might even be looking at a higher glycine content in the eggs when you're consuming most of the more meat scraps, which is very high in glycine. So we eat a T-bone, we'll throw the bones to the chickens, and they'll pick it apart. And I think it's a lot of people don't realize you can have chickens even if you live in the suburbs. You can have a few chickens in your yard really easily and feed them your meat scraps, and they'll make you some good eggs.
They're little dinosaurs, like Joe Rogan says. Chickens are like fucking dinosaurs, man. I didn't know they would eat meat. That's crazy.
Oh, they love it, man. Yeah,
That's wild. Yeah. But I think that that's an important issue, that only eating muscle meat, I fear, will lead to nutrient deficiencies long term. And they're easily testable. I mean, vitamin A levels are testable, folate levels are testable. For folate, you can check RBC folate or homocysteine levels. For biotin, you can check organic acids testing. Riboflavin is another important one if you're only eating muscle meat. Um, and then the things like copper and zinc, these are hugely important. So muscle meat is complemented by liver specifically. All the organs are important, but if Michaela's eating liver, that makes me much more confident in the long-term sustainability of that diet. And I know that, people will point to people like the Andersons
Mm-hmm.
saying, oh, they've only been eating ribeyes and water for the last 20 years. But, I don't think that there's no laboratory study there for me to tell what's going on. And,
Check out, there's a
they're,
chicken, right? I got a rooster about to invade my house. I got to chase him off. My dogs are too well behaved and they don't attack him. Get out of here. Go, go. Sorry, they'll creep right into the house and they'll start pecking around. Maybe we might need to get them we feed them some corn, give them some organic corn that our neighbor grows, and we might need to get them a new sack of corn because it seems they're coming up to the house for food. They usually stay away.
That's funny. They're
some well-trained dogs though, right? They don't do anything.
I know, right?
Well
That's
fed.
probably because you're feeding the dogs too much good meat.
Yeah.
The dogs are living large, Tristan. So, but yeah, I think it's important to eat the muscle meat and the liver. So yeah, when you talk to Michaela, you'll have to ask her, and because I don't want the same thing with Jordan. I mean, Jordan Jordan Peterson, who we're talking about, has a crazy schedule, and he, I'm afraid for him to just be eating the muscle meat long term. That's not super sustainable. So
Well, it seems like liver is pretty palatable to most people, and if you actually, if you learn how to prepare it, it's really not so hard. Here, I got a little for the audience and for Paul. No, we got your address so we could send you a copy, but we got the Carnivore
nice.
cookbook is coming out
Love it.
in like, oh man, we're doing a pre-sale. I think the pre-sale starts in a few days. So there's a link down in the description. But yeah, we show you how to make all the organ meats. Let's see if I can find the table of contents here. So page 183 over here, we start the section. So, we've got a whole section on organ meats. We show you how to use all the parts of the animal, bone marrow, all that good stuff. So yeah, little shameless plug for my wife's book. I didn't write this one. I got a writer's credit on the last book, but this is all her. Look at that cover too. Look at that pretty cover. So we're excited to get this one out. Yeah, she's stoked.
She's not putting you on the cover of that one.
No, she's like, this is my book, dude. You don't get a writer's credit.
What was the first one that you wrote?
It was a keto cookbook, right? So there was a lot of plants and stuff. The last few years we've kind of transitioned into almost all animals. At the time when we made it, though, we ended up putting a whole section on organ meats too. So we showed people how to make liver, and we've been trying to get people to eat these organs for about 5 years now, and people are starting to catch on, kind of. I don't know.
That's the fight.
Sean Baker still refuses.
That's what it's about. I mean, there are these desiccated liver capsules.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a small step in the right direction, but probably not the right dosing. It's probably hard to get adequate dosing with those capsules. So
now, when you're eating liver, like, do you eat it raw or do you cook it?
I don't cook it. I either eat it raw or dehydrated. When I do it raw, I make sure to freeze it for a couple of weeks prior to get rid of anything that's bad in there. I don't really worry about that, but just for the sake of anything in the liver, I freeze it for a few weeks, or when I get it from the grocery store, it might already be frozen for, weeks.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times I will dehydrate it at about 135 degrees for a day or two. And so mostly what I eat is liver jerky. I've talked about that on my Instagram feed, and people can see me eating liver jerky all over the place now. So liver
that's cool. I think we show you how to do that in here. Yeah, it's easy. You just cut strips and dehydrate it, and they're more like chips, right? Don't they they're not really.
Yeah, depending how thin the liver is, I think it's better to make it as thin as possible, and maybe I should call it liver chips. They have the texture of a chip or something, and
kids like them. Kids will eat those.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The texture is fun. It doesn't taste like nacho chip or anything like that, but it's not bad. Yeah. I never liked cooked liver at all.
It's hard to get it right, man. If it's not cooked enough, the texture's weird. If it's cooked too much, the flavor's awful. So you got to get the right if you cook liver right, it can be okay, but it's just I like it raw. You know what? You think I'm crazy, but have you ever tried like high liver? Have you ever tried fermentation of meat? You know, putrefaction intentionally. It's that's my favorite way to eat liver is actually like
We
3 month old liver.
we talked about that last time. I haven't tried it yet, man, but I want to. I think it was you and I talking about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably. I'm the only crazy
That's
one out there.
that's intense, brother. I mean, I would try it for sure. I know like Sverige does high meat and high liver, and okay, well, I guess I'll
Yeah, I
frost
don't
some
know about
out.
fair. That guy also wants to drink baby's blood, um, so yeah. But
That
the high
sounds,
liver is great. It's one of my favorite ways of eating it.
yeah,
It gives you
yeah.
like
But I do,
it's a probiotics, the carnivore probiotics. Well, that
if
that's
we
an
need, who knows if we even need that?
yeah. Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about because we do see. And I haven't delved much into the scientific literature on this, but we do see some indications that probiotics can be used to affect brain health. And of course, a lot of these are made from the fermentation of plants. So, yeah, well, have you looked much at the probiotic argument for probiotics are good for your brain, probiotics are good for your gut? And what would you say about a carnivorous diet, perhaps being short on gut biome feeding material that might benefit mental health and psychological health. Like people say, lactobacillus organisms, lactobacillus reuteri, and a lot of these other things supposedly have a really beneficial effect on inflammation and on the brain. What do you think about that?
Yeah. You know, this is a super interesting rabbit hole. The context that I would give here is that most of the people who are touting Lactobacillus plantarum or Lactobacillus reuteri are also selling those supplements,
Of
and the
course.
probiotics have now become a multi-billion-dollar industry. To give some more context, I will suggest to people, or I will point out that fasting actually increases the alpha diversity of the microbiome. So the idea that we need to put anything into our gut to have what most would consider to be a healthy alpha diversity or a diverse gut is false. We don't even need to put things in our gut and we get an increased diversity in our gut. Now, eventually, if you're not eating, the gut flora may go down. But in the short term, fasting increases the alpha diversity of the microbiome. And what we have seen more and more, anecdotally, at least in the carnivore community, I've seen from multiple people now that when they do things like ubiome and viome and GI map, things like I've done it myself multiple times, we see very robust diversity and populations of all the normal species of gut flora on zero fiber diets. So this really starts to fly in the face of some of these previously held notions that kale is a brain food or that you need tons and tons of soluble fiber to feed all the good gut microbiome or the gut microbes. This is totally false. This is really a fairy tale that we are being told. There's another prominent psychiatrist in New York who just pushes kale as brain food, and I just think that is so wrong for so many reasons. But there is nothing to say that kale is brain food, whether it's the fiber in the kale or other nutrients in the kale that he's saying are brain food. I say that's
Yeah.
bullshit. It's probably hurting us because of all the isothiocyanates and affecting our thyroid. That's a whole other rabbit hole. But the idea that we need fiber is something I discussed at length with Lane in the debate. And I think there's so much evidence now that humans do not need fiber in the diet. There is no benefit to fiber in the human diet. And then if we look at the microbiome, there are more and more studies suggesting that fiber probably doesn't really even change the microbiome that much.
Mm.
And there's no evidence that fiber changes the microbiome in a positive way.
Exercise changes it, right? They found that intense exercise can increase the what is it, akkermansia.
Yeah,
Um, so I mean, you're not eating anything; you're just exercising, and that's changing the gut microbes. I mean, we could probably make the case that meditation, thoughts, thinking different thoughts, emotional states could even affect the gut microbiome. I
it
mean, we could.
probably
Do you think
does.
we're looking at signaling molecules? Do you think those gut microbes are actually behaving almost like neurotransmitters within our gut, giving information to each other?
Oh, absolutely. We know that. And we know that the sort of the milieu or the sort of attitude of the gut microbiome affects the vagus nerve and
Hmm.
affects systemic inflammation. There are some studies that suggest that probiotics can be beneficial in depression. And I think that in those studies, we're hitting on something here. And the idea that we're hitting on there is that the gut microbiome does affect the brain. Okay. That is all I think that those studies suggest. I don't think those studies suggest that we need probiotics. And I don't think those studies suggest that those probiotics are doing anything unique, because I would argue that dietary changes are the strongest way to alter the gut microbiome. We know this. More than a probiotic, what we change in our diet will affect the gut microbiome in terms of in a much greater sense, in a much more long-lasting sense. Probiotics have been found conversely, and these studies are not nearly as widely publicized, to delay the return of the microbiome to a normal state after antibiotic administration. So this is not totally clear. I do think there are some applications for probiotics in people who are receiving tons of antibiotics for Clostridium difficile. Some certain strains of probiotics appear to be beneficial, specifically Saccharomyces boulardii, which is actually a yeast organism. It's a eukaryotic organism, and perhaps other strains or other probiotics like VSL3, which has been studied.
VSL3, that one's mostly because I've looked at that. I've actually used VSL3 after a round of antibiotics, but that's just when you look at what's in it, it's nothing special. It's just a bunch of lactobacillus strains in high doses, though.
Yes, yeah, and so it's we don't really understand how they all work and whether one strain is particularly valuable versus another strain. And the marketers want you to believe that they have the proprietary bacteria that's the magic one, but I would say the diet is the way to affect it. And sure, if you give someone a probiotic, some probiotics might be harmful, some of them might be slightly helpful. What we generally see is that probiotics do not persist in the gut, and that the changes that probiotics are inducing do not persist after we stop the probiotic. So this gets into a situation where you have to keep taking the probiotic for the rest of your life, which doesn't sound like a good thing. And the probiotic is only 3 or 4 species. The largest probiotic might have 29 species. There are over 1,000 species in the gut. So
just identified, right? How many have we not identified?
And there's all sorts of articles people can look at for the dark matter in the gut. All the species that can't be sequenced. I mean,
right. As soon as they're outside of their environment, they could die off, right? Because, like you said earlier, we're looking at a complex biome, an ecosystem of communication. So if it's like you just throw in one organism in a super high amount that's transient, I mean, how could we expect lasting effects from this?
It's transient and it's not evolutionarily consistent unless we're perhaps talking about a lactobacillus fermentation, or dirt. So I think that, humans exposing themselves to dirt, that's a natural probiotic.
Yeah. Actually, horse poop. Horse poop, I think they've done studies, someone correct me, I'm sure, but they've done studies on exposure to horse manure helping people breathe better, helping with asthmatics and stuff like that.
I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, exposure to the natural environment, even just being in nature, we're going to inhale some dirt and some dust, and we're going to get some organisms that way. Going for a walk in the forest affects your microbiome, even if you don't eat some dirt. I mean, a lot of times when I'm going for a walk in the forest, I'll reach down and scoop up a little bit of dirt, where, not on the part where people are walking. I don't take a handful and eat it.
Paul Saladino gets some dirt and he busts a line of dirt off a log in the forest.
Right? No, but if I'm out hiking, especially in the Pacific Northwest, I'll walk 100 feet off the trail and dig around in the dirt a little bit. Just to see what's
great.
In there.
It smells great, and what they call it forest bathing, right? We have to come up with scientific terms for go outside, dummy, right? That's
go outside,
crazy.
get in the wilderness. Yeah, I think in Japanese it's Shinrin Yoku is forest bathing. But so I will actually I will eat a little bit of the dirt, a small amount of the dirt, and people say, oh, you're going to get a parasite. Yeah, well, I don't think a small amount of dirt is going to give me anything terribly bad. But then there's humic acid and fulvic acid, which people are making supplements of now, which you can just get from eating reasonable dirt that's not in a city and polluted. And exposure to some dirt is probably evolutionarily consistent and was probably a part of our microbiome and stuff. And so those to me are much more evolutionarily consistent ways to affect the microbiome. Being in nature, drinking spring water, eating a little dirt because you probably would have when you were camping, or your ancestors probably would have, or
Well, I mean,
maybe like
we
high
literally
meat.
we get the microbiome from our parents, right? We inherit it from our parents. So I guess the further down we go in the generations of living in these cities where we're seeing such physical degeneration, then we're probably going to be so much more removed from that natural microbiome that 5, 10 generations back our ancestors who were a bit healthier would have had.
Yeah, I mean, it's malleable. It changes throughout our lives. Certainly,
Mm.
we all get it from our mothers as we go through the birth canal, or, I mean, this is the whole argument around C-section babies. Do we need to inoculate them with like vaginal fluid to give them the microbiome of the mother's vagina? And, probably there's some communication between the rectum and the vagina of the mother as the baby's
Mm.
being born. But,
Yep.
it's
Five, 10 generations
that's probably
back,
where we should be getting
our
the first
ancestors
part of
were.
our microbiome from. And then it's going to evolve over the course of our lives. And there's even evidence that in utero, there are bacteria that are being passed to the baby. And people say, oh no, that's sterile. Like, I don't think that's totally true. I think we're finding that now. And then there are bacteria that actually transit from the mother to the baby in the breast milk now,
Mm.
which is pretty wild. So, yeah, the way that we're being influenced by these things is pretty radical. And
Now,
I think it's clear we don't need plant products to have a healthy microbiome. And I've talked about this on other podcasts. There was a paper that came out in Cell a number of about maybe 3 years ago, and Rhonda Patrick talked about this on Joe Rogan, and everyone loved to parrot this paper, and it was so frustrating to me because it didn't seem like people had actually read the paper. But it was a study in mice where they the thing that everyone was saying, Rhonda Patrick and Stephen Gundry and these guys were saying, if you don't eat fiber and you don't eat prebiotic starches, then the bacteria in your gut will digest the mucus layer in your gut, and you will get gut inflammation. And
Ah, yes,
this
yes.
is such bullshit because
What about
the study
fasting?
that what's
Well,
that?
fasting.
Yeah, and I'll pull up the paper. The study was done in rats or mice, so it's not
Hmm.
even a human study. And the conclusions that were drawn quite um, were quite a leap. I do not think that they are supported by the actual study when you look at it. Let me just find it real quickly.
Yeah.
Probably here in the fiber. Uh, I have.
Well, I think it's really interesting that, vitamin B12 is actually created through microbes as well. Our most bioavailable source of B12 is not dirt, as many of the vegans would say. Oh, we're just supposed to eat dirt, and if we drink spring water and eat dirt, we'll get vitamin B12. But we get it from animals, and it is a fermentation process that actually creates B vitamins, vitamin B12.
So the paper is in Cell, which is a very highly regarded journal. Title is A Dietary Fiber Deprived Gut Microbiota Degrades the Colonic Mucus Barrier and Enhances Pathogen Susceptibility, which sounds like, oh shit, like we need it, right?
Right.
But if you actually look at the paper is done in animals. So this is a mouse study. And what they did was they began with gnotobiotic mice, which are mice that are raised with a germ-free gut. And they introduced into the gut of these gnotobiotic mice a 14 bacteria containing human-like microbiome. So they
14 bacteria is human-like?
14 species of bacteria, which were supposed to be a human-like microbiome.
That's like
So
saying that water, that blood is just water and iron, right? Let's just.
right. So they created this human-like microbiome in a mouse, um, and composed of 14 species, which were all fairly predisposed to eat carbohydrates. So it was a carbohydrate-loving series of bacteria. If people read the paper, they can see which ones they actually used. It's here on the paper. I can tell you the names of the bacteria. They use Bacteroidetes ovatus, Bacteroidetes uniformis, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. Eubacterium rectale, Rosaburia intestinalis. They did use Akkermansia. They use an E. coli species, and they use Clostridium symbiosum. But they admit that this is a fiber-liking set of bacteria. So they use a synthetic human gut microbiome in gnotobiotic mice. And then what do they do for the intervention? They give some mice high fiber diets and some mice low fiber diets, and they compare to see what happens to the mice gut and the mice microbiome. Well,
But they don't compare health outcomes?
there were no differences in health outcomes.
Oh,
So histopathology and body weight measurements over time of mice from the groups with reduced mucus thickness did not reveal changes compared to the mice consuming the full fiber diet. So what they're saying is that there was a small decrease in the mucus layer of the guts of these mice that were fed very low fiber diets, but there was no change in the histopathology, which could indicate any real pathogenesis. So they say, collectively, the data transcribed above indicate that fiber-restricted colonized mice experience some erosion of the mucus barrier and some altered intestinal responses, albeit without overt signs of disease. So there was no evidence that there was any disease, and there was no histopathologic change in any of the immune cells below the gut, below the lining of the mucus. Mm-hmm. So basically, this is the study that Stephen Gundry and Rhonda Patrick are citing, saying you need prebiotic starch. Wait a minute, this is in mice. They're using a fake microbiome.
A human mimicking microbiome that's not human mimicking. Like, yes. which humans is it mimicking?
Yes. Mice.
14 strains. Come on. This is the thing. This is what gets so confusing to people, because they're like, well, science says. People don't understand that, like, science is not an entity. Science is a process of exploration of the...
says. Stephen Gundry says.
Right.
Oh, my God, that guy.
Dr. Greger says, I need the daily dozen. I don't think people realize that Dr. Greger's daily dozen is how many bowel movements you have per day on that diet. It's not the foods. It's how many times you poop.
But the idea that we need fiber for a healthy microbiome is totally false. Mm. And there have been other studies which showed that decreased diversity was a problem. But when we look at that, in those studies, they saw decreased diversity. The decreased diversity correlated with inflammation and insulin resistance. And we know that on carnivorous diets, we don't get either of those things. And we actually end up not seeing decreased diversity at all on these types of diets.
Well, here's another interesting thing. And now somebody could double check me. Somebody in the chat or in the comments will say I'm wrong. But I remember a study. All right. Is it true that sterilized microbiome rats actually live longer than rats that don't have a sterilized microbiome? I think I've heard that, like, a completely, when they wipe out the biome of a rat, that they will actually live longer. Now, that doesn't mean that they have, better quality of life or that they have more energy, but.
I'd have to look at it.
Well, I mean, it might be something to look into later. I'm not saying that's an argument I would make, but it's like, that kind of just shows right there, well, a sterilized microbiome leading to longer life in this whatever type of rats it was. Somebody can maybe cross-check that reference. That would show right there that it's kind of a moot point, right? They're living longer with a sterilized microbiome. We know that sterilizing a microbiome of a human being with a bunch of antibiotics isn't going to result in better health. Or probably a longer life anyways. So I think it just kind of shows that.
And one of the things that we've seen to be very effective for humans who are having recurrent C. diff is fecal transplants. And, fecal transplantation is when we have to sterilize the gut during fecal transplantation. So we'll sterilize the gut with a bunch of antibiotics, and then we'll actually use poop as the ultimate probiotic, because it has everything that, or mostly everything that would be in our gut. And then it can repopulate the gut in a good way. So if people really want a probiotic, they should find someone healthy and go eat their poop. I mean, I'm kind of joking, but that's probably the best probiotic.
We've got some vegans on YouTube that seem to be moving towards this idea. They're collecting poop from everybody, trying to tell them how to stay vegan. If you just let me look at your poop, I'll tell you how you can eat all these lectin, phytate, and oxalate-rich foods again. I think we might be seeing some low-key experimentation of that right now.
It's crazy. I mean, we do it. Gastroenterologists are doing it now. People come in with recurrent C. diff, and actually for Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, they're starting to do more fecal transplants, and they can do fecal transplants with an endoscopy or via pills. They can just make poop pills, and somebody just swallows a bunch of poop pills.
Did you hear that they're trying to regulate this and make this illegal for people to do outside of prescription and pharmaceutical stuff? Yeah, right. So there you go. That's going to be profitable. We better patent that. So
exactly. Once it gets to be, once it gets to be profitable, they're gonna put the kibosh on it. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
there are some dangers to it, but anyone who's doing it is gonna, assume all the dangers. And we know that fecal transplants are very helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I would argue that for IBD, carnivorous diets are also really helpful. And if anyone is thinking, if anyone is watching or listening and has inflammatory bowel disease and is thinking about a fecal transplant or has had a fecal transplant and it hasn't worked as well as they wanted to, I would urge them to consider a carnivorous diet. I can't ever give medical advice, but I think that this is a really viable tool for people, especially people with inflammatory bowel disease.
Yeah,
It's huge. I mean,
Crohn's, IBS. I mean, even just like
Crohn's
symptoms of,
IBD, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, even without, the diagnosis of IBD, I think a lot of people experience those symptoms and never get it. They just think it's normal. They're like, "Oh, I'm just supposed to be pooping 20 times a day, just blasting liquid that burns from my butt all the time." And they think that that's how their life is supposed to be. And they don't realize you don't have to live like that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, IBS and IBD are a little different, but yeah,
Yeah.
the inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, or autoimmune.
Hmm.
IBS gets into this spectrum of like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which probably is also an autoimmune condition
Yeah.
having to do with hypofunction of the myenteric plexus and the migrating motor complex in the gut related to autoimmunity. I think carnivorous diets can be really helpful for SIBO as well. I mean, in the clients that I've had that have had small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, carnivorous diets have been the most effective intervention because in small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, all the bacteria from the colon have moved through the ileocecal valve into the small intestine, and they're fermenting fiber when we eat it, causing major gas and bloating. The bacteria aren't supposed to be in such high numbers in that part of the small intestine. And when they are there, it's a real problem. And so eliminating the fiber helps to like get rid of those bacteria. And then hopefully with other interventions, you can heal the gut or at least tamp down the immune response. Your body stops reacting to something, and the autoimmunity that's hurting the migrating motor complex neuronal cells of the gut goes away. This kind of brings it back for a circle a little bit. We see neurons in the gut being affected, just like we see neurons in the brain being affected by these autoimmune inflammatory.
You have more nerves
mechanisms.
in your gut. Your gut, the inside of your intestines. Am I wrong in saying that we have more nerves, and that is one of the most sensitive parts of the human body?
Oh yeah, yeah. We have a lot of nerves in the human gut. I mean, they call it the second brain.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell. I couldn't. I'd have to like look it up. I think there probably are more neurons in the brain, but
No, I'm not
there's
saying
a,
neurons, but just it's more sensitive. Somebody I recently heard say, but yeah, it's neither here nor there. But it's obviously intimately connected with the brain, directly through the vagus nerve too.
directly to the vagus nerve, and that's the lectins we were talking about. Molecules can move up the vagus nerve. That's crazy that there's a tunnel, there's a super highway, not a super highway, but there's a path,
From the butt to the
it's,
brain.
yeah, directly through the vagus nerve. And that's a scary thing. And then also systemically through inflammatory mediators with the immune cells. So basically the hypothesis is plants being introduced in the human body can transit across the leaky gut membrane and activate the immune system in the lamina propria, which is the section of the immune system below the GI lining. And then that immune system gets triggered. It reacts against plant antigens, whether those plant antigens are benign or meant to be harmful. Then the immune system gets activated and responds against whatever part of the body that immune system is sort of susceptible to respond to. And this is where we get differential manifestations of autoimmunity in different people. Some people might get autoimmunity with eczema or psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel disease or depression or anxiety. I've given talks where I liken it to, you ever seen The Price is Right where they have Plinko, that game Plinko? That's one of my favorite ones. If people haven't seen it, they should look up Plinko. It's a slanted board with a bunch of pins on it. And at the bottom are all the markers of how much money you get. And at the top, they put in a disc. And the disc goes down through the maze of pins and ends up in one of the buckets of money based on sort of a chaotic process. But I would argue that that disc is like inflammation, the pins are like your genetics, and the buckets of money at the bottom are all of the autoimmune diseases. So inflammation comes into any specific body. We have a certain genetic makeup, which makes us more susceptible to one thing or another. And then the inflammation ends up manifesting in one condition for one person and another condition for another person. But when in fact, the inflammation is the commonality between Hashimoto's thyroiditis, rheumatoid arthritis, depression, inflammation, ankylosing spondylitis, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, psoriasis, eczema, et cetera, et cetera.
And this is why when people's immune systems get tanked, whether that be from poor gut microbiome, or disrupted gut microbiome from a lot of these plant toxins, or the opening up of the gut wall, perhaps through like glyphosate or something, or even like poor sleep, or improper light exposure. That's why I know I saw you the other day. You were using some red light. I know you're
Love
into
it.
yeah. So I mean, it's light exposure, sleep cycle, or circadian rhythm. All these things can affect autoimmune conditions, but diet is. It seems to be one of the most powerful things we could do. So I guess I know you've got to run. You got a busy life. You probably got some clients to meet with. Just to close up here, we've got a lot of people in the chat right now who might be interested in trying to correct some, mental health issues, some neurological issues, some inflammatory responses they're getting from foods, and they're looking at changing their diet. We have a lot of former vegans who tune in here, a lot of people who are on the fence of leaving veganism or not. Like I said, we're running a vegan rescue operation here. What advice would you give to some of these people who are trying to correct their health and improve their mental health as far as diet goes? What are some steps they could take?
I think that you could think of it as a continuum. And the first step on the continuum would be getting rid of all the processed foods, And the second step would probably be something like a paleo diet. Get rid of dairy, get rid of nuts. Well, like paleo and then AIP paleo. So paleo would technically just be grains and legumes and dairy. And then they could progress to getting rid of nuts and seeds and nightshade vegetables. What we're doing here is we're iterating around elimination diets, and we're thinking which foods might be triggering you here. And I think that's a very, very, very powerful intervention. So if people are looking to improve autoimmunity, they can go through this iterative process of eliminating foods. At the end of the continuum, I think people could just jump right there and do a carnivorous diet. If that's not sustainable or not something that they can get their head around, you could go through, a process like getting rid of the processed foods, getting rid of, dairy and grains and legumes, then doing AIP, which is autoimmune paleo, which is going to get rid of things like nuts and seeds and nightshade vegetables, which include potatoes and tomatoes and eggplant and other triggers, and some of the hot spices like the capsicum spices or the green peppers, things like that, or chilies. And then you could go to something like keto, which is going to cut out even more foods, more of the high, sugar foods like fruit.
So almost like a GAPS type protocol, right? Like that seems like they've got a decent one. And what do you replace them with? What foods should people focus on? Like what should we be eating? We know what we shouldn't eat. What the heck should we put in our body?
My feeling is that animal foods are the most nutrient dense form of nutrition for a human. They provide all the nutrients that a human needs in the most bioavailable forms in the properly balanced amounts if we're eating nose to tail. So I think that any healthy diet must be founded fundamentally upon animal foods. Nose to tail animal foods eating is the best foundation of any human diet.
What about which animals? So I noticed that chicken, pork seem to give people reactions much more than like beef and fish. What animals do you recommend?
I would say ruminants and seafood as a base. I like beef, and then seafoods need to be in there as well for omega-3 and iodine sources. But yeah, that's interesting. That's your observation as well. I think pork and chicken can be more triggering for people.
Do you think that could have to do with methionine? Do you think methionine in pork could be an issue?
I don't know it's that. I think it's just pork is dirtier. It's hard to get organic grass-fed pork. I don't even know the pork. Pigs probably aren't supposed to be
pastured. Well, they'll eat a little bit of plants, but they'll pasture and they eat a lot of. They'll eat their own babies. Pigs will eat anything. They say never mess with a pig farmer because the mobsters, they used to use pigs to dispose of bodies.
Yeah, they'll just eat people. Yeah, pigs will eat anything. And so, maybe a wild boar. I've got some friends right now in Hawaii who are hunting, wild boar. And, if those are foraging, that's probably, I would suspect that animal might be easier for people to tolerate. I think most people are eating pigs that are conventionally raised. Yeah. It's pretty hard to find organic pig. And then even if you're eating an organic pig, it's fed exclusively grains.
Right. So animals that eat grass, they chew the cud. You're looking at mostly the cud
ruminants.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to start for people. But cool. I do think a carnivorous diet is a pretty darn good place to go. And a lot of people end up there in terms of elimination diets. They end up on a carnivorous type diet, which well constructed, I think, is a pretty darn ideal human diet.
Yeah, the first phase of GAPS, I mean, the most whittled down version of GAPS ends up being basically carnivore. And they've been
Yeah,
getting really good results with that. Now, I've got a few super chats. If you got a couple minutes, we can just answer them real quick if you want.
yeah.
Yin Yang says, is there causation between IGF-1 and cancer, especially specifically from dairy products, or are those studies flawed? So IGF-1 cancer question.
Well, this is
Very
interesting.
nuanced, right? That could be a
It gets to be
3-hour
it gets to be
podcast.
tricky. Sure, if you overactivate IGF-1, you are probably going to be pushing anabolic type mechanisms. I would argue, and I've talked about this on other podcasts. Actually, this morning I did a podcast with Carnivore Cast, like I was talking about. When that one comes out, people should listen to that. We probably don't have time to go into it today, but the association of IGF-1 on carnivorous diets is not strong if you are not eating dairy. So I don't advocate people eating dairy because of casomorphine, satiety, casein, whey, etc. So when I think of dairy, I don't include that on a carnivorous diet. Dairy will trigger IGF-1. Leucine will trigger mTOR, not through IGF-1, but the leucine triggering of mTOR is much more transient than insulin. Insulin is the biggest trigger for IGF-1. We care about IGF-1 because we care about mTOR. IGF-1 and insulin trigger mTOR. The whole reason people talk about IGF-1 is because of mTOR. So mTOR is mammalian targeted rapamycin. So what you really care about is mTOR signaling. Well, a carnivorous diet without dairy is not going to overly activate mTOR because leucine is only a transient trigger of mTOR. Insulin is a much bigger trigger of mTOR for a much larger amount of time. You are going to get much more IGF-1 and much more insulin on a mixed diet, eating all the plants and all the squash and all the sweet potatoes. And that is going to lead to much more mTOR and potentially more carcinogenesis, or at least anabolic processes in the body, than eating a carnivorous diet.
Great answer. Great answer. So did it trigger you? And I was drinking a little bit of raw milk earlier. Now, I want to say
No.
to the audience, I'm not. You guys see me drinking raw milk every once in a while, but you got to understand I'm putting on a little weight now. If you're trying to lose weight, if you're trying to get rid of an autoimmune condition, you probably don't want to mess around with the dairy. Most people aren't drinking raw dairy, and I think there's a huge difference as well between the raw and the pasteurized commercial stuff. So although I do consume some raw milk, I'm not saying all you guys should do it. Right? It's about context. So I definitely agree. Dairy is a great weight gaining food, and it can be pro-inflammatory in many people. So if you're sensitive to it, you should probably avoid it. He said the same guy said, is charred meat really carcinogenic?
Yeah, sure is. There's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines in charred meat. But when you say charred meat, I am imagining a piece of meat that's like really fucking charred, right? In the studies that I've seen, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines are only in significant amounts in the highest levels of burned charred meat. So if you go to make like a hamburger or steak and you just brown the outside, I do not think there's any evidence that that amount of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or heterocyclic amines is going to trigger a precancerous process in the gut. You have abilities to deal with those. If you put the steak on this grill and you burn it, which would be freaking tragic.
It tastes like crap too. What are you doing?
You burn a hamburger,
or
you're burning your, like, why would you burn meat? Like, don't burn your meat.
It's
like,
so much better rare. It's just so much
absolutely a charred piece of meat does have a significant amount of PAH, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Heterocyclic means yes, they do. But in most people with sensible cooking of meat, even eating meat for your only food or a carnivorous diet, are not going to get enough PAH and HCAs, especially if you're doing things like sous vide or soups or anything like that. Even if you're cooking a steak on the grill, just don't char it, man.
All right. Just another little thing. I think I've heard you touch on this. I think you mentioned maybe in your HPO podcast with Sean Baker. Shout out to the great Dr. Sean Baker, who got his medical license back. So everybody who out there hating on Sean Baker, former doctor. Hey, he's still a doctor. Leave the man alone. I think you said something, and it was a really interesting point. When these people are talking about the hormetic effects of plants, and you mentioned that these heterocyclic amines or the the hydrocarbons, what is it? The polyaromatic hydrocarbons, that they actually trigger endogenous release of glutathione.
They do. So
So you could
they're
make you could this could be the new sulforaphane. We could be telling people to eat
we're
charred
gonna be
meat
rich,
capsules.
Tristan. We're gonna be rich.
We're gonna sell you guys charred meat capsules because it's gonna cure every disease, like Rhonda Patrick's broccoli sprouts, guys.
It acts through the same mechanism. People can fact check me, but polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines turn on the NRF2 pathway in the liver, which is the same pathway that sulforaphane turns on.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So the vegans aren't saying eat your charred meat, guys, and eat with your broccoli sprouts. It makes no sense to me.
it
And
doesn't
thank
make
you
any
so much for
sense.
pointing that out. I think that's genius, and that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Last thing, okay, we got. I like to eat liver raw, like oysters, says Eli. That's awesome, man. Me too. I only eat it raw or rotten, but I'm a crazy mofo, so maybe don't try that at home. Rom says another great discussion. Can you do this once a month? Can you please provide a list of the 3 blood tests I should take to get a holistic picture of one's health? Dr. Paul Saladino is always welcome back on. I'd like to do this every other day, but there's no time, right? So yeah, we'll definitely make a conscious effort to do this more often, Rom. And what about the list of the blood tests? Where can they find that information?
Man, I did an Instagram post about the blood tests that I would do. There were more like 30 than three. Um, there's not three. I mean, I can give you the top three,
Maybe
but
she's referring to, you mentioned the Great Plains organic acid test, and the other one maybe
yeah,
is
yeah. So
comprehensive
I
panel.
don't know that organic. So Genova makes a test called the Nutri-Eval, which I think is valuable. GI Map from Diagnostic Solutions is a gut test, and then some sort of comprehensive blood work panel, which includes lipids through NMR, as well as inflammatory markers, and a thyroid panel, as well as an iron panel. And you're also going to need copper, zinc, and a bunch of other stuff. So it's complex, and you probably need to work with a functional medicine doc. But if you get a Nutri-Eval and a GI Map, you're going to be at a good start. But then you also want to see your lipids, and then I also want to see inflammatory markers, HSCRP. I want to see fasting insulin. I want to see iron studies. I want to see thyroid studies. That'd be a good start.
All right, so you're not so hyped on the organic acids test that a lot of people are pushing. What do you think about that one?
The Nutri-Eval from Genova actually has an organic acids test in it. It has 75 or 77 organic acids. The Great Plains has like 170.
Hmm.
I think the Genova one gives you mostly everything you need.
Okay. All right, man. Well, Dr. Paul Saladino, MD, where can they find you?
So this is probably on YouTube right now. You guys should all go to my YouTube channel, which is Paul Saladino MD. I'm trying to put out some good content there, guys. I'm doing more lives. You guys can interact with me there. It's hard to get to all the comments there, but check out my YouTube channel. It's Paul Saladino MD. I've got another curcumin video coming out real soon. If you guys want to work with me, you can send me an email. It's paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. I do see patients throughout the world for functional medicine stuff. My last name is spelled Saladino. I'm on Instagram at Paul Saladino MD. I'm on Twitter at MD Saladino. And I tried to start a war or a discussion with Rhonda Patrick today, but I don't think she's going to respond.
She's not going to take the
And
bait.
she won't take the
She
bait.
doesn't like
And
that. She
then
likes to. She's very. Not you're being rude, but she doesn't like to argue with people. Like she likes to be very polite, and she just pushes her information. She doesn't seem to respond to any critique.
yeah, we'll see. And
Hopefully.
then I am on Facebook at Paul Saladino MD, and I have a Patreon at Paul Saladino MD.
There we go. Paul Saladino, MD. Check him out. Thanks for hanging out, guys. We're out of here. Peace.